So streamlines are another pattern that you see often in nature, and streamlines can blend in with other patterns quite easily, so they can blend in with waves, they can blend in with spirals, but basically a streamline is a more continuous, long expression of flow that you see through a landscape, and it may be a flow of water, it may be a flow of air, but it's in appearance it's a long streamlined flow. So some applications of it might be in a stream, for example, where you've got the water flowing through the bed of the stream, and it flows along, becomes more disturbed along the bottom, so it can get formed into spirals as it hits a rock or another disturbance on the bottom, and often a result of that disturbance and a swirling of the streamline flow, which might pick up speed and then take off again as another streamline, is that you get a deposit of material on the bottom of that stream due to the disturbance of that streamline, which is carrying these materials, and as that flow gets disturbed, it deposits those materials that were in it. And fish make good use of this. If you're looking at a stream and you see a stone in the stream, a fish will often position itself just behind the stone because it knows that as the water flow is hitting that stone, any of the small invertebrates or insects that are in that stream are likely to be disturbed and settle from that flow of water, and it will snap them up, it will have that opportunity to catch them. Also because the flow of water itself is being interrupted and swirls around the back of that stone, it's creating a little water flow pocket where it doesn't have to work so hard to maintain itself in that position because the water is swirling around it instead of pushing it back. So it locates itself in a position in relation to the streamline of water around it, where it's going to be fed more easily and require less energy to maintain its position in that area of the stream. In a forest, you've also got an interaction between the trees and the wind, and the wind's going to be streamlining across that landscape. As it hits the forest, it acts as a disturbance, and what a forest will do is streamline the edges of it so that it creates as little disturbance to that wind as possible, because the more mechanical resistance or disturbance it creates to that wind, the more it's going to suffer from the turbulence from the disturbance of that wind. So if it streamlines itself in form, the wind is going to be redirected up and over the forest without creating too much disturbance and maintaining that streamline, and therefore it's going to be less mechanically disturbing to those trees. Again, you get a little deposit of material, so some of the wind will be dissipated through that forest, and as it gets dissipated, the energy of that wind is slowed down and reduced, and some of the material that was carried in that wind, all the dust and some of the nutrients that are in that dust, will deposit, and you get an area at the windward side of that forest where you get a deposit of these materials, which can be quite rich. So the application of streamline in a permaculture landscape would be thinking again what elements are kind of flowing through that landscape, and how can you pattern your productive elements in relation to those elements that are flowing through your landscape. So some of the elements that do flow through your landscape are things like contours. So they have regular increase in elevation throughout the landscape, and you can pattern your placement of a forest, for example, in alignment with those contour lines. There's also wind that's flowing through your landscape, so you can contour the edges of trees so that the wind is lifted up and over the trees and doesn't create too much disturbance on the other side. So you've got the flowing of wind through the landscape, and the flowing of water ties in with those contour lines because water is moving down those contours, so you can create patterns which help capture the water that's flowing through that landscape. and store it so that the water has more potential to seep into the soil and for the nutrients and the water to be assimilated by plants and other living systems within that ecosystem and slow down, so the energy is slowed down within it, instead of that water moving too quickly through that landscape, which has erosive potential, but also the water and the nutrients have less ability and less time to be absorbed by the biology of that system. So I was thinking about these elements that are flowing through the landscape and patterning in a way that makes good use of those resources they provide before they leave that landscape, or if they're a destructive element like a severe wind, trying to mitigate that element and pacify it so that it is not destructive on the property. And some of the ways you might pattern the elements on your property is if you've got contours, as most places in New Zealand do, you can grow your trees in contour lines on that landscape in harmony with those contour lines, so that and you can swale this out too. So a swale is where you dig out a ditch and you create a burn with it, and you can plant your orchard rows on that burn. And as the water's moving down a slope, so if this is the side profile and it's moving down a slope, it falls into these swales, which would be on these contour lines here, and soaks into the soil. So it's a good place to position your trees, because they will have more opportunity there to absorb the water and the nutrients that are in the water and assimilate that into them and help capture and slow the water that's moving through the landscape. So that patterning would be more in harmony with those elements that are flowing through your landscape than a pattern which is more this kind of grid, rectangular pattern that you commonly see in an agricultural system that is not in harmony with those elements. So again, you're trying to pick a pattern that is observed in nature with the flowing of streamlines across landforms in nature. So again, you're picking a pattern that is observed in nature with the flowing of streamlines across landforms, with water and wind across those landforms in nature. And you're trying to make use of those patterns you observe and apply them in the most functional sense in your permaculture designs. And so doing, what you're achieving in this instance and in the other pattern examples also, is you're making best use of your understanding of the patterns you observe in nature, and you're harmonizing your production in relation to those patterns you observe. And you're picking the patterns which are most suitable to the type of production that you wish to achieve, so that over time that system is going to increase in resiliency and diversity in production, because you have aligned your production in a way that matches the patterning that those elements would naturally take in nature. So it makes sense, and it's a way, it's really at the heart of permaculture design, is understanding patterns that you see in nature, incorporating them into your design in a way that has functional sense and represents the way those elements that are productive elements in your design, the way they would pattern in nature. So picking the most suitable pattern for the type of production that you wish to achieve.